Hello, wherever you are, and welcome to Keen on Yoga podcast. So, it's just me again today, and today we're going to talk about community, yoga community, Ashtanga community, general community. And it's a big topic, and I think, like everything, is nuanced, has its pluses, has its minuses, and well, let's get going and see where we land with this. Before we do that, we just say I'd love to see you at any workshop or retreat that I'm doing. Have a look at the website. You might catch me in 2024. If you don't, we've got 2025 on the schedule, a new schedule lined up there. We've still got places for retreats in Salento in Italy, and Goa in November, Malaga at Christmas in Spain, and that's just a few. And we've got spots for this retreat, so let me know if you're interested. Ask me a question or reach out to me. I'd love to let you know more about that. Anyway, let's crack on with community today. Let me see where my mind wanders, and share your thoughts with me after this podcast is over. Let me know what you think. Emil Durkheim talks about anomy in terms of a sense of unsure expectations about society, what society wants of us, and the sense that there's no real state holding or supporting us anymore. Well, does that sound familiar? I think increasingly that is the state we feel, alone in a crowd with an uncertainty about our place, our role, and a no clear sense of belonging anymore. Increasingly, and I thought I'd introduce that community there, increasingly community is necessary, and it doesn't mean, unfortunately, perhaps social communities anymore. It means we form small pockets or small little coteries, small little groups of people sharing their own ideas, opinions, a sense of belonging into these little fragmented groups. And I think that's the way society is going forward. I don't think we have any possibility in the current times, as far as I can see, for more of a collective community now. And I think that's Emil Durkheim's theories of anomy has been resonating with me as I've come back to London in this last week, and coming back to my home in London, and seeing increasingly it feels, well, not like a home, not like my home. Looking around again, seeing that it's just this sense of fragmentedness and isolation that I feel, and I imagine others feel, walking along with headphones on, walking along, looking at mobile phones in a group, in a massive group, but yet so alone. I mean, I think Teresa was wondering to me, how do people meet each other? How do people, become friends with each other and form relationships now in London, which is such a strange thing to have to reflect in such a vast place that it's hard to meet people. But it's true. Absolutely. So community is essential, and that's really one major reason I got into Ashtanga. It has Ashtanga yoga, and as a Iyengar yoga, I know because I started with Iyengar yoga as well, and Hatha yoga. All these yoga teachers have communities around them, and I think that's really important, because when you're doing yoga, you're essentially swimming against the tide of life and many social expectations. You're swimming against the tide of stimulating yourself more. Basically, you're trying to stimulate yourself less. You're trying to distract yourself less. You're trying to become more aware. And society, I suppose, is all about trying to distract ourselves more, stimulate ourselves more, be more in terms of materially demonstrating ourselves to be more. And so yoga is kind of going in the opposite direction, right? So I think to that end, I think you need a sense of just like we need a sense of community around us anyways. Especially, I think it's something like yoga, which is swimming against the tide of normal social expectations, even life expectations that you follow, going from education to a good job to a family, and all those things that, well, I think are expected of us, even in the modern age. And maybe you don't want to do those things, or maybe they haven't happened. And so having that community in yoga is, and for me as well, just was a real lifesaver, a real lifeline in life. And I think it's not to be underestimated that that's a big part of it, right? But nevertheless, it doesn't always go all well, or at least, as I said, it's, like everything, there's two sides to it. We have this shared sense of belonging. We have a need to belong. But then, of course, you can have a strong teacher with strict rules that can, well, give you the feeling that you are outside the group unless you conform to their rules, that, if you're not in, you're out. And a clique oftentimes there's a clique that's been that collects around this teacher of the most in favor students that are the most on program, let's say, the ones that do exactly what the teacher says, right? That kind of fawn towards the teacher, and then they're given special privileges. And if you don't feel like you're really following that line, exactly what they say. If you want to have a sense of autonomy, this is what I'm saying, then I'm not sure that many of the Ashtanga groups that we see allow for that sense of autonomy, right? And that's, I suppose, my concern. And well, I never, although I said I appreciated the a sense of community, I would say I also struggled with it, being someone who has their own opinions and doesn't wholesale believe in everything. I mean, the thing is, you need to believe in everything the teacher says, right? I mean, I've heard this many times. One small disagreement can really then have your privileges drawn as a person in the class, and you start to feel that you're not welcome anymore. And yeah, I don't think it's me just being a downer again, reflecting upon this. I think I've heard it from people, which is such a shame that we don't allow more flexibility within and around the teacher and the community. So I would like to say that I try and encourage that people can be part of whatever it is that I help build, and have their own opinions, have their own ideas and ways of doing things, and I'll still support them. And then, I don't think we need to follow everything the person says to be involved and in a shared collective of something. But I think if it doesn't belong, I mean, there's different ways to do a community, right? You can either structure it around a teacher, right? So everything is pointing to the center, or in this modern age, people have also tried to structure it, say, like the teacher or the guru is outcast, is thrown out or disgraced, and then the community, like I say, Anusara or a Bikram, kind of carries on around in its in itself without the teacher at the center. So the community is kind of self-governing. And that also has its problems because, I mean, there's a hierarchy there as well, and group politics and collective decision making is very difficult. And I don't know whether it's ever possible that we exist as human beings without without the wish to exert power over each other and find our place in the hierarchy, or let's say compete in the hierarchy. Call me cynical, but I feel that we will always seem to do this thing with established groups, that we end up kind of making a whole politics around them. And that was my feeling in Mysore in the end, that if I wasn't in, I was out. And if I started speaking, even saying one thing in contradiction, or not even in contradiction, even in let's say just opening up a discussion, that it wasn't you believed in everything hook, line, and sinker, we say in English, that you believed in everything wholesale, accepted every part of it. And if you didn't, if you even raised a question, then you're out. And so obviously, speaking like I do now, there is less probably place for me in Mysore, let's say, than there was in the community that I had, which is a shame because, I did have friends in the Mysore community. Anyways, so on the other hand, the Ashtanga community is it's an amazing thing. You can go anywhere in the world. You can go anywhere in the world and pick it up, right? You can pick up with any teacher. You know what you're doing. The rules and the regulations in a certain respect. And that's an amazing thing, right? There's this worldwide kind of shared community. On the other hand, the fact that you can pick it up and put it down anywhere means that the sense of what you're doing is rather homogenized, right? You have to, when you go to a Mysore class, you have to do exactly the series in the way that it's done in Mysore, but that's the way it goes, right? I mean, there's pluses and minuses, and as always, I'm not trying to give you the conclusions. I'm just trying to keep the discussion open, that there isn't an ultimate community, that it's always going to be flawed, right? As much as you have a sense that you can go anywhere in the world and practice your sequence, you also have certain regulations around how you can do that, how you can turn up, how you can perform your practice in the class, right? And it's a homogenized and generalized sequence, right? That's how it has to be to keep some sense of center, right? A firm center. I'll come on to that in a minute. The firm center and the expanding edges, one of my favorite metaphors right now. Anyway, so it's flawed, but nevertheless, it's an incredible thing. And I think fairly open and inclusive, right? I see people of all types, body types, ethnicities, walks of life being invited in and being given space. And I think we can do more. We can always do more, but it seems like that modern rhetoric, that narrative, which is obviously an incredibly positive one, is expanding into the Ashtanga community as well. And we're seeing communities made more available for people, and we have a few names here I shan't mention them, that are trying to break down Ashtanga, one of them hopefully me, and make it accessible for anyone, even if you haven't got the perfect body, the idealized body, the young body, the flexible body to do these things. So you can still do it if you enjoy repetition, flow, a sense of community, that you can still be part of it, right? And then there's the money thing in terms of the inclusivity. Yeah, this is not always ideal. I think it's still often too expensive, and I'm well aware of that, coming from a background as a cook, as I did. I never had any money. I was never a professional in any form of fashion. So I really had to, I worked my way around teaching. I worked as a cook generally to support my learning in different centres and in exchange for for teaching, right? So, and then I was supported by my wife, Teresa, who had a proper job, right? As often is the case. I'll always be grateful to her in our trips to Mysore. I could never have gone to Mysore on my own had I not been supported by Teresa, right? So, yeah, money is a problem, and it's still a problem, and yoga is still a luxury, and it's not afforded to all people. And yeah, community is a privilege, because those centers, those places where the yoga classes take place, are obviously in more affluent places usually, where one doesn't feel, if one is not from those places, so welcome, right? And it's, even in this modern day and age, still very white, very middle class, and yeah, that obviously makes people that aren't of the certain demographic feel less like they might fit in there in that place, right? Which, yeah, there's a whole other discussion, and I'm ill-equipped to talk further about inclusivity, but I have done a couple of podcasts that do talk about that. You can look up with a couple of people. Names don't come to mind now, sorry. But the Modern Yoga Centre has a lot to do with this as well, in terms of taking the responsibility for inclusivity, I suppose, in type of media, social media it puts out, in the message it puts out, but also just in the way it structures classes, right? I mean, the Modern Yoga Centre is a modern thing. When I started, there was no yoga centres. There was just church halls or rented spaces. And that made community kind of immediate, in a sense. The teacher would take people out for coffee at different points, and there would be meetups, right? Pretty much everywhere that I did yoga, there was some sense of people meeting and sharing. But in the Modern Yoga Centre, not so much, eh? Even though it seems like it's more inclusive, there's a cafe, there's shared changing rooms, there's shared facilities you can hang out in, right? There isn't that sense of community. And I think one reason is that all these different kind of classes. And what can you do? It's a business, right? But that's how I found it when I was teaching more recently, a number of years ago now in London, just teaching Ashtanga classes, all levels. And the problem is that they're all levels. And this all levels class is generally structured over the whole day. All levels Ashtanga, all levels Vinyasa, all levels whatever, right? So what ends up happening is that people generally take a class rather than form around a teacher or even a style. Yep. So you have a kind of transitory population that kind of picks and chooses and doesn't feel affiliated to any particular teacher or style or even the center, and they don't meet each other because they're coming in and out of different classes. Again, I'm sorry to point these things out. I haven't got the answers, but we can keep discussing these things. maybe we can come up with some firmer resolutions around what we do. But I mean, in terms for me, when I was seeing different people come week to week in my classes, yeah, there was no sense of community, and I stopped, and I could never carry on in the long term for that reason. That you just felt like almost as a service provider doing a class for a random group of public, very soul destroying and spiritless. And so that just shows that community in the class is palpable. You can feel it as a teacher, you can feel it as a student. I think if we're doing something, opening our bodies in a class with other people, we need to feel a sense of shared belonging, a sense of shared collectiveness somewhat, right? Even if we don't know the people, that we recognize faces, because you're trying to open up, for God's sakes. You're trying to be vulnerable to yourself, and just at a random class amongst random strangers seems counterintuitive that would happen. So yeah, the modern yoga context, eh? And it's not all bad, of course. There's positive for the freedom of community, the freedom of a lack of a firm teacher with a firm center, like I said, a strict teacher with a firm clique around them, a firm established group of students. That can be off-putting as well. The freedom to go to any class and just be anonymous and not feel that you have to subscribe to this whole kind of, I don't want to say guru-esque thing that can form around teachers all too easily. Yeah, that's kind of positive and empowering for the student, right? So there's always positives. I mean, we could look at the same in Ashtanga. When Patabi Joyce was alive, there was a stronger sense of a firm centre governed by everyone, all teachers, in allegiance to Patabi Joyce. Since he's passed, some teachers are in allegiance to the modern Mysore and Shiratji. Other teachers aren't, right? And this has created, in some respects, more autonomy around Ashtanga and more discussion, right? As that firm centre has been somewhat dispersed. On the other hand, there's a fragmentation, a palpable sense of greater competition amongst teachers and bickering amongst divergences or differences than maybe there was under Patabi Joyce. There's pluses and minuses, but all we can do is discuss this stuff, eh? So, yeah, a community might be spread outside class as well, might just exist in class. We're hoping that it spreads outside class to a sense of belonging to something generally. I feel that it should spread outwards, and we find that. I mean, and because I think we want it. I mean, even we find that online with my classes online that people recognise each other online, the name, and then they meet each other in person. Sometimes and even online they kind of go and check out each other's social media and become friends. We need that, and as I said, flowing against the tide, doing Ashtanga, swimming against the tide, doing yoga altogether. I think, and you need a sense of collectivity around what we're doing, trying to raise our awareness and not, I think, along society. Society is all about trying to dull our awareness, right? Anyway, so where can I go from here? Yeah, so another aspect of the class, right, the sense of belonging to a community in class is that you do this very interesting thing, which is essential in the modern context, which is kind of how would you say this, interfacing your own private experience with a public experience. You're belonging to something, but in yoga it's very interesting. Like in football, I mean, as an English guy, I played a lot of football. You're completely part of a group, right? There's no private experience. There's nothing but in yoga, you see, you've got this private experience of your inner world interfacing with the public experience of yourself in the class. And I think that's very helpful because this is the real sticking point into, I think, altogether in a very broad context of the human being. You've got a private experience going all the time. You've got a public experience that you have to play along with all the time, more or less, right? Unless you're on your own in your own house. And the difference between the private and the public, that's the difficult bit. That is the bit that often we get stuck at, right? We have a different experience on the inside, or we don't feel so sure how to explain ourselves on the outside, how to represent ourselves on the outside. So I think that they're very useful in the yoga class, that we have this possibility, if it's done right, where the teacher can kind of allow a space where the individual can kind of play around with their public persona in the yoga class within their private experience at the same time. I mean, I kind of feel that we're always playing roles. I'm not sure that there should be or ever is this egoless state that some people will say they're aiming for. Rather, we're always playing different roles, and at different times of life, obviously, we play different roles. In fact, all day we play different roles in terms of being, in different relationships with different people. So in the yoga class, we get to experiment with our role a little bit, I think, and maybe we change, even, in the space of the yoga, even, kind of experiment and change our roles and the way that we play ourselves, right? If the teacher allows that space and doesn't dominate it with their persona so much, which of course we still see. Obviously, they're dominating with their persona gives a stronger sense of collectivity sometimes around that teacher and around what they say. But on the other hand, it doesn't allow the individual to experiment so much and have the freedom in terms of seeing themselves as a collective outside the teacher's remit as to what that means, right? So I feel, my perspective is to allow that space as a teacher for an organic sense of community to arise amongst the class without the teacher necessarily having to be defining what that is, or even at the very center of that space, perhaps. Maybe as a kind of symbol, as a figurehead, or as a representative of the whole thing, but not necessarily. I kind of feel that not necessarily giving all the color to what that might be. Anyways. the healthy group dynamic is always a work in progress, I guess. And the teacher doesn't always get it right. We don't always get it right. Sometimes we could be too forceful in terms of trying to inspire the community. Sometimes we could perhaps not give enough structure around the community. So if the teacher is perhaps too lackadaisical, we say too relaxed, too, let's say, letting go of everything, and you can do whatever you want in my class, right? Anything goes. Then there's a lack of a sense of firm collectivity in that class, right? But obviously, if they're too strict, then you have this sense of being in or out, and having to toe the line or you're out. This kind of thing that we see in Ashtanga as well. But I've seen the opposite as well. The teacher being too just chilled out, and then nothing happens at all in terms of feeling a collectivity around what we're doing. So it is a fine line. Can we do anything about making checks and balances around this in terms of kind of making sure that the teacher doesn't become too powerful and too culty, let's say? I don't know. I don't know about that. The yoga center, in fact, helps to do that, but obviously it decimates the teacher's power as well. They become completely lost within the modern yoga center. But then the yoga center maybe has also the capacity sometimes to just let's say we don't have any kind of one watching over us as teachers, so it's easy to go a little bit off-piste or out of control. And I think many teachers naturally, and I think it's natural, they get a little bit of popularity, a little bit of respect from their students, and something starts building up around them, and it kind of goes to their head, and before you know it, you've got this whole strange dynamic going on with them at the center, and it's a dangerous thing. But yes, how can we police this? I mean, as I've spoken to before, mentorship, the lack of having a mentorship program in yoga generally is crazy when you're dealing with individuals in emotional states, and you're this lone teacher on your own without any kind of mentorship or regulation or policing around you, let's say. In every other profession, from hairdressing to psychology to mechanicship, being a mechanic has some kind of further training around it. Someone looking over your shoulder and saying, how's it going? At least how's it going? Not necessarily kind of judging you or but just supporting you. Yeah. So now you get onto this idea of firm center and expanded edges. Someone asked me recently, well, in an ideal world, where would you like to see Ashtanga going? Well, do you think it's going in the right direction? And what would you like to see the Ashtanga community look like in the future? You know what? I have to say, maybe it's going perfectly, right? Maybe everything is going perfectly. I mean, I think there always has to be a firm sense of center, and then these expanding edges. I'm one of these expanding edges, I suppose. Not necessarily voices from the margin shouting against the center, but just expanding the dialogue. But the center can't do that. If the center was expanding the dialogue, there'd be no firm center. That Ashtanga would be lost to vinyasa. And what you saw in Ashtanga in the first place was the firming up of Ashtanga, which wasn't so firm, as I've often spoken about. Early on in its inception, Ashtanga was a bit looser until power yoga, vinyasa yoga, all the kind of extra spin-offs of Ashtanga started arising, started shooting up, and then Ashtanga had to be firmer to define its space. This is Ashtanga, whereas when those didn't exist, obviously Ashtanga didn't have to be so rigid, right, to define itself, right? Otherwise, it would lose itself now. So I think the same in the modern context. If Ashtanga doesn't keep a firm center in Mysore and Sharat, then it kind of loses its sense of what it is. If there was just people like me expanding the dialogue. So I'm grateful for the firm center, and I don't shout against it. I think we need that as well. And I think if you can do that for a while, and if you can, I mean, I did it for a while comfortably as a younger guy, and going to Mysore, that is, and doing the postures in that way that's prescribed there, exactly as it said, that's fine, and it's good, and it's enjoyable if you can. But there's many, many people that can't. And as you get older, I think most of us can't do it like that anymore. So if we ever could. So, we need both. We need the firm center and the expanding edges. In fact, any tradition, in order to not to get stuck and die, it needs to be expanded from the peripheries. I mean, look at what we call Hinduism now. I mean, that's been expanded dialogue from established Brahmanism, right? The Brahmanism being traditional, established, and he doesn't invent anything, doesn't innovate. But then from the outside, all these different innovators, they're innovating all the time, and it's gradually incorporated into the center without the center ever admitting it, obviously, like every center, right? Gradually, I mean, Sharat including consent cards on the mat, so you don't have to have can put your card and say, I don't want to be adjusted, or, I've seen using props. We had a couple of props in the old Shala and Gokulam, I remember. These things gradually get expanded into this rigid center without anyone really saying or admitting it, right? So it does happen, and we need both. You need the center, but you need the expanding edges at the same time, right? And that is, I think, just impossible to do otherwise. But how do we recognize then when things go wrong? Well, as I said before, I think we've kind of talked about a lot of those things. The teacher becomes too powerful. You feel like you can't say anything anymore. You feel like, might feel like you can't go to any other teacher. You have doubts, but you can't express them. All these things might suggest that the community has become too rigid, and maybe, but the thing is, I was going to say, maybe, one needs to look further afield, but there's all these kind of variations of community. And, well, of course, it's a shame that they can't all see eye to eye, but I guess that is the way it is. I mean, we're all defining ourselves in a community in the first place as part of something. So those communities tend to define themselves more. The closer the difference, let's say, the more specifically the community feels a sense of self, right? So the community doesn't feel such a sense of itself, defining itself against people that don't do yoga, right? That doesn't give that much definition, right? But the closer the thing is, right? So say defining itself between two styles of doing Ashtanga, like someone who's doing Mysore style, following Sharat, and someone who's maybe not so strict, right? Defining itself against that, for example, which is a general differentiation, I think, in the modern Ashtanga community. Are you in the Mysore camp doing it exactly like it's done in Mysore, or are you not, right? That division makes us a much stronger sense of self within the community, right? Because the division is so small that it actually really defines much more clearly what it is. Do we have to have this polarization, this binary approach to Ashtanga, right? Where you're in or you're out? As I said, I think it's part of this firm center expanding edges, but it's all part of the play. It's all part of a whole play. And yeah, I feel like I said I was on an expanding edge, but I feel like I've got a foot in both camps, really, because I don't shout against the tradition of Mysore because I enjoy it and it's essential as well. It's just not necessarily inclusive to everyone. So you need both, right? You need both things going on. Finally, I would go to this sense of community and autonomy, right? Just to wrap it up, community and autonomy, and preserving one's autonomy. And I said, well, how do we know when community's gone wrong? Well, that's when your autonomy is lost, right? When you sense of your individual, because you need to have the sense of being an individual as part of something. So the two things need to be preserved and balanced in one. And when you haven't got any sense of individuality anymore, any sense of self-volition, right? You can't control your own experience. That's when I think the alarm bells have to ring. And unfortunately, often that time is in Ashtanga Yoga, especially where there's the physical assistance going on. That's often through adjustments, right? That one feels you don't have any sense of being able to say no anymore, or I don't want to be adjusted, or questioning why you're doing, what am I meant to feel, or any of these things. So you set this when the individual one, me, you, loses ourselves of our sense of ourselves in terms of a body, an individual body that has its own autonomy to control itself. That is when community, I would say, has gone badly wrong. And it's hard because I think even within the modern context where we can say, is it okay if I adjust you, or as a teacher, this is right, and it's a loaded question, right? Because the teacher is obviously there's an inevitable hierarchy with the teacher playing a role of leader of the community, and that is a weighted question because the student doesn't have the same power as the teacher then, always to say no, right? As the teacher is, some sense, the leader, right? So it's difficult. And I think that's why it's increasingly great to see all these different parts of Ashtanga community in relation to each other, because there's more flexibility now, right? There's more flexibility that you can go to somewhere else. You can go to practice somewhere else. You can develop and be part of something else. So I think in a sense, the teacher has to be more careful and thoughtful in terms of the way that they relate to their students, because the student themselves has more power than ever to decide where they go. It's not just like, well, you go to this Ashtanga class in your town, your city, or wherever you are, or otherwise you don't, right? Now you can go online. Next day you can go to another teacher probably down the road. There's more possibility to preserve your sense of autonomy and be part of a community. Maybe, just maybe, we're in the very best place that we can be with Ashtanga. I don't know. You may say no, and if you've been the victim of abuse in a community, or had been taken advantage of, which is totally possible, then you might have your reservations about community. On the other hand, without any community, I would say that's not what we want either, right? To have no community at all, I think the idea of Sangha, right? It's an Indian Sanskrit word for community, Sanskrit word. You need that. It's always been essential on the spiritual path to have. It doesn't mean that you have to be mates. It doesn't mean you have to be friends with everyone in the community. Literally, it just means a sense of doing something collectively, having a group energy around you, having some sense of being supported by like-minded people. Yeah, even if you don't know them, even if you just know that they're there, even if it's familiar faces that you see or names you hear on screen. That's incredibly empowering. On the other hand, of course, it can strip you of autonomy, and that's not good either. I know of many occasions, and I'm sure you do as well, where certain figures in the community have become too powerful and have led people to lose their sense of autonomy and take advantage to some degree of people's openness or need for connection to be part of something. So, of course, that's not good either. And I haven't got the conclusion, as always. I haven't got the conclusion as to how we make checks and balances around this experience exactly, or the role of the modern yoga center in this either. All I can say is we're working on it. We're working on it and having a free, open discussion, being able to speak our mind and not be victimized or ostracized, right? Made heretical is the first step. To feel free that you can speak out, and that you don't have to accept everything. Like there can be discussion around things, whilst generally having a general sense of consensus, so you can still discuss issues together. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know whether I've done the subject justice. Please feel free to comment and discuss further with me in the comments below. And just know that your subscription to the podcast, your liking and your reviews really help the podcast altogether and its continuance. Anyway, we'll be back next week with another guest interview. And until then, I hope you have a great week. Bye for now.